things turned on here. Seem to be turned off. There is a camera recording us, though. You know, everything else seems to be off. Red dots all over the place. There we go. Now see Tahoka. See us. It's like we're in the dark. There we go. That's fixed. I think Hale Center is out today. I don't know about Post. It looks like maybe they're out too. So we'll have to record this and make do with who we've got. We'll start out using the PowerPoint Federalist Presidents, and in a minute we're going to switch over to one called Republican Republic. Can you see that on your notes and readings? Should be in Unit 5 lectures. You see it there? Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you find it?
Which one?
Republican Republic. Unit 5 lectures. Unit 6 lectures.
Yep.
You don't have Unit 6 lectures. Let's find you some lectures. Really quickly. Everybody, I'm going in to look at our Blackboard. little bit later today, I'll put up the full Unit 6, but for the time being, you should now be able to see this, I think. Okay, it's up there now. I'll change it a little bit this afternoon, but for all intents and purposes, 8B, Republican Republic, up at the top of the page now. And if you refresh your notes and readings, you can follow along on that. It might be a little bit clearer than the board, but we're not going to use it just yet. Let me finish off with George Washington. We talked about some of the things that George Washington had to face with in terms of foreign affairs. I think we talked about him dealing with it. Did we talk about the XYZ, not the XYZ affair, but did we talk about the neutrality, George Washington saying that we were neutral and we weren't going to get involved in the French Revolution? Seems to me we did. Anybody in Tohoku awake? The people in this room look like they're zombies. That's what happens when you have a long weekend. We talked about, I think we talked about Citizen Genet, and I think we talked about also the fact that we had to respond to pirate attacks from the Barbary pirates last week. It's been a long time, I know. It was last Wednesday. What have you got in your notes there? You got anything? Mm-hmm. The pirates? Mm-hmm. Okay. So we did deal with all of the, with early foreign affairs for George Washington. I think we talked about Citizen Genet, the guy that came over and violated our neutrality and almost got kicked out. He was supposed to be the French ambassador. Let's talk about some domestic issues that George Washington's going to have to face. In general terms, one of the things he was afraid of was that having fought the Revolution and gone through a number of years under the Articles of Confederation, we were pulling apart in different directions. There was political polarization. You could see it in kind of the arguments between Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. Not exactly arguments, disagreements, let's say. They were fairly civilized. Americans were taking sides on the French Revolution. We're going to have a few other problems domestically. One of them is settling problems with the Indians out on the border in the frontier area. The British were out there. Did we talk about John Jay? And I think we did. John Jay's treaty, and we talked about Thomas Pinckney's treaty, just as we concluded last time. John Jay went over to England to try and settle things with the British about a number of issues. Being out along our border, capturing our ships during the French Revolution, taking our sailors from time to time, quite often in fact, and other things. What we got out of that deal was that the British promised to pull out of the border area within 2 years, They told us we could do business down in the Caribbean, they wouldn't get in our way anymore. One thing that we asked for that they said they weren't going to do, and that's to pay for the slaves that they liberated while they were over here during our revolution. So Jay's Treaty wasn't all that popular in America when they got here, because the British also forced us to recognize their concept of neutrality, which was, rather than doing business with everybody, it was doing business with nobody. And we really didn't like that. It affected our income. And I left last time talking about some of the domestic problems that he was going to face. He's going to face an Indian War, the Northwest Indian War. He's going to face the Whiskey Rebellion. And he's going to have to persuade Congress, because of the problem we were having with the Barbary pirates, he's going to have to persuade Congress to pass an act authorizing him to build a navy. Now that Congress had the power to tax, and it had some income, of course, from land sales as well. The Northwest Indian War was really a vexing problem, because we'd sent out different groups since Washington became president. Two of them were badly defeated by an Indian kind of confederation or alliance out west. One was under a general named St. Clair, and we lost almost 1,000 men in that battle, 1,000 casualties, if not all of them killed. So finally, in 1794, George Washington's going to send General Anthony Wayne out to the border area with about 2,600 men, also supported by some Kentuckians, some Kentucky frontiersmen, and they're going to fight a battle called the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. They will win that battle. They'll sign a treaty with some of the Indians out in the Ohio Territory, in which we give the Indians about $10,000 in return for all of the territory that now includes Ohio and Indiana, and some of the territory up along the banks of the Great Lakes, particularly up around where Chicago is now, where Detroit is now. We're going to establish a line called the Greenville Line, which separates it. Let me see, I'll get you a picture of it here. Nope, went too far. There it is. Plus it's a little hard, I'll get it up there for you. If I can persuade the machine to cooperate. Over on the right-hand side there, you can also on the left-hand side, you can see roughly what the Northwest Territory was. And over on the right-hand side, once again, you see part of the Northwest Territory. And Hammer's defeat in 1790 and St. Clair's defeat, where we lost so many men in 1791, led to George Washington sending a force out there, and they're going to fight a combined force of, I think, Miami Indians and Shawnee Indians, perhaps. And it's called the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The reason it's a Battle of Fallen Timbers is because there had been a tremendous storm up in that region, and there were a lot of trees down in this particular area where they fought the battle. Then they'll establish the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, and that line you see under the word Treaty of Greenville, in theory, that separated the American settlers from the Indians' territory. That line won't last very long because settlers can't be held back, and they're going to keep sliding into that territory. Also, you might look on this map on the left, we talked about Jay's treaty, but Pinckney's treaty with Spain establishes this line right here. It's on 31 degrees north latitude, or otherwise known as the 31st parallel. Everything below that and west of the Mississippi River either belonged to Spain or was claimed jointly by Spain and Georgia and Tennessee. You see all those little blue things on that left-hand on the left-hand map? That's where there were British outposts, and really, according to the Peace of Paris, that should be American territory. So part of Jay's treaty was to get them to agree to leave that area. Okay. So that takes care of the Northwest Indian War. One of the famous leaders of that was a fellow named Blue Jacket. I think maybe next time I'll tell you a little bit more about that. In fact, when we get to another Indian war we're going to have down the line, just before the War of 1812, we'll talk about the details of all the treaties we made with them, and then we broke. Not because the government necessarily didn't intend to fulfill the treaty, but because individual people started sliding into that area, and there's no way the government could stop them all. So the Indians, of course, will view that as a failure of the government to keep the treaty. Rightly so, I would say, and they're going to be angry, and we'll have more conflict. One other thing that Washington had to achieve was to get some money to build ships, and they're going to pass a Naval Act in 1794. Strangely enough, it's called the Naval Act of 1794. The House of Representatives and the Senate, what they call it is an act to provide a Navy armament. Go figure. It's going to authorize the President to acquire or build 6 frigates. We're going to build them from the ground up. A frigate is the second largest type of warship under sail. It's got in between 36 and 38 guns, maybe 40 guns on it. It's one deck or 1.5 decks high. It's much faster than the largest of the warships, the ship they call the Ship of the Line, which had 74 guns, and so we thought that's all we needed to protect our coast, and also to go over and protect our commercial ships from the Barbary pirates over in the Mediterranean. We'll build about 3 of those, and then the government's going to lose interest in it, and they're going to stop funding anymore. That's going to have to do with a couple of presidents down the line that didn't want to have a big military. So George Washington is going to serve for 2 terms. I didn't mention the Whiskey Rebellion either. Alexander Hamilton, of course, was collecting liquor tax, and the people out in the western part of America, out in western Pennsylvania, out in western New York, out in that area, they tended to make a lot of alcohol because it was cheaper to transport alcohol than it was to transport crops. So they converted their crops into alcohol. It was also worth a lot more and easier to sell. And when we slapped that excise tax on their alcohol, they felt they were being discriminated against. And you're going to see a group of, I guess you call them frontiersmen or anything. They call themselves Whiskey Boys. And they're going to kick up a fuss out in the area of Pittsburgh. In fact, they're going to threaten to take the city of Pittsburgh. And George Washington's going to have to issue a proclamation declaring them to be committing treason, and he's going to raise a force of men, a pretty big force, almost 13,000 men. He'll put it under command of Daniel Morgan, and he's going to go out there and settle the issue with the Whiskey Boys. And he'll do it in kind of a political way. There will be limited violence. The Whiskey Boys will be scattered by this large force of soldiers coming out to meet them. A couple will be captured, a couple of the leaders will be captured, and George Washington very quietly, when the dust settles, will pardon them. They're tried and convicted of treason, which was a capital offense. But George Washington will pardon them once they agree to behave themselves. One of the problems with this is another regional issue. In this case, it's people out west being upset with the people in the east, feeling that they were paying all of the money that the people in the east were using for other purposes by having to pay tax on the whiskey they produced. So that's kind of what we get from George Washington. We get 3 states added to the Union while he's president. We're going to start facing this regionalism, people from one region disagreeing with people from another region, which worries him. We're going to have an election in 1796. George Washington, of course, refuses to run a third time. So the Federalist faction will pick John Adams, the vice president, to run for president, and they'll pick Thomas Pinckney, the guy who made a name for himself by getting the treaty with Spain, as their candidates. And the crowd that was kind of around Thomas Jefferson, we're going to start calling the Democratic Republicans from here on out, almost a political party. Some people in history books call them the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans political parties. They weren't really like political parties that we talk about now. They didn't have party conventions or anything, and they were pretty small groups. Pretty much the elite people that had money, people that had property, and they kind of get together and decide who their candidates are going to be. They don't have a party convention, any kind of primaries or anything like that. Alexander Hamilton wanted to run for president, but most of the Federalists thought he was a little bit of a loose cannon. He was a visionary, but they didn't think he was solid enough to be a president. So they passed over him. This made him angry, and he blamed John Adams for that, who got the nomination. So he tried behind the scenes to get people to vote more votes for Thomas Pinckney than they voted for John Adams, so that Pinckney would become president. That backfired, because it did split some of the Federalist vote, and you ended up with John Adams being elected. He still got the most votes, but Thomas Pinckney didn't. And so we're going to have John Adams elected president and Thomas Jefferson from the other side elected vice president. This was a failing in that electoral system the way we had it set up. Before he leaves office, George Washington will speak before Congress. He'll leave his farewell address. I think I put that in your notes and readings. You don't have the notes and readings for Unit 6 yet, but I'll put them up. They're written. But in short, George Washington was worried about disunity, and he didn't like regionalism. He didn't like party politics. And he thought also if we got hooked up with foreign countries, it also caused us to have divides in our own domestic situation. Particularly, his example would be the French Revolution, and the fact that one side of our political spectrum favored the French and the other side didn't. The Federalists tended to be more sympathetic to the English. Why? Well, for one reason, they were led by John Adams, who was partial to the English, and another reason because that's the people they did the most business with. So that's where we leave off. We've got a new president, John Adams. Poor guy didn't get a really good deal out of this, because there's a lot of stuff left hanging when George Washington leaves office. One having to do with our neutrality policy. And his party's going to start to fade. The Federalists are going to start to lose ground. Adams was pro-English. He was a moderate Federalist. He was pro-English. He tried to get along with Thomas Jefferson. And I've got to say they were friends from before, but as Adams went through his presidency, they'll become less friends. And Jefferson, even though he's the sitting vice president, he's kind of shouldered out of the mainstream by Adams and Adams' Federalist allies. Another problem Adams is going to have is that we still didn't have this process of selecting cabinets figured out all the way. And we had people in the Secretary of War, Secretary of State, people like that, left over from Washington, and they didn't quit when Washington was out of office. And we didn't have a process that required them to leave when the president left or anything like that. We really actually, even now, don't exactly have a process like that. We figured out how to deal with it. Basically, it's to get them all to agree that they're going to resign when the president resigns. So the people in the cabinet, the Secretary of War, Secretary of Treasury, they're all loyal to Alexander Hamilton, not to John Adams, which makes it a little bit difficult for him to deal with his own cabinet. Secretary of War he'll replace pretty quickly. The Secretary of State, Thomas Pickering, never gets along with Adams. And he's kind of an obstructionist. And Adams takes a long time because he believes in doing things the right way and following the right process and all that. He takes a long time before he realizes these people aren't doing their jobs the way he wants them done and replaces them. And that's going to cause him trouble throughout his presidency. One of the big problems we had, almost as soon as we concluded the treaty, Jay's Treaty with the British, the French got miffed because we were supposed to be allies of the French. At least they felt that way, even though Washington had declared neutrality. And they start taking our ships the same way the British were taking the ships. Now, the British had already agreed to pay us back for the ships they took in between 93 and 94. By the time Adams is in office, by the time he takes the oath of office in 1897, the French have already captured 300 of our ships. Some returned, some not, some cargoes taken, most of the cargoes taken. And we have a problem because we don't have an ambassador in France. Washington relieved James Monroe, who was very popular with the French. Washington thought he was too popular with the French and that he wasn't being firm enough in his dealings with the French. So he brought him home, and they sent out another man to take his place by the name of Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, one of the Pinckney boys, who was related to Thomas Pinckney, the guy that got Jay's Treaty from down in South Carolina. But he had a problem because the Minister of State, their government was organized a little differently than ours. The Minister of State, who took care of foreign affairs and a lot of domestic affairs in France, was a fellow by the name of Talleyrand. And he was pretty corrupt and kind of a Teflon man. Nothing touched him. He lived on and he lasted on and on and on as the Minister of State in France. And when our ambassador, our designated ambassador, arrived there, he had to present his credentials to Talleyrand, and Talleyrand never seemed to have time to have a meeting with him. Kind of reminded you of that girl that you wanted to invite to the prom who never answered her telephone when you called. Or who was busy for the next month or so and couldn't talk to you. He just avoided him. And so Adams has this problem, and it's going to get him into a problem right away. He has an idea. He tries to always settle things in a pragmatic, practical way. So he selects two men, one a Federalist, one an anti-Federalist or a Democratic Republican. One was Elbridge Gerry from Massachusetts. He's the Democratic Republican, believe it or not. And one was John Marshall from Virginia, who was the Federalist. And we'll hear about him later. He sends them over to reinforce Charles Cotesworth Pinckney and says the three of you ought to be clever enough to force your way in and present Mr. Pinckney's credentials so we have an ambassador and we can negotiate this problem we're having. The problem went on, and eventually, we're going to say by about 1798, we're almost at war with France. They call it the quasi-war, which kind of means the almost war. They were taking our ships, but no one had declared war. And they were claiming they were taking them because we were doing business with our enemy, the British. These three guys are in a hotel room, and once again, Talleyrand's not talking to anybody. And then one day, three gentlemen show up at their door and saying, we've come to talk to you about setting up a meeting with Talleyrand. So they invite them in. And it quickly turns out that in order to have a meeting with Talleyrand, they have to pay these three gentlemen each one of them a bribe of $250,000. Not only that, but they suggested to the Americans that the way to get Talleyrand's attention was to offer their allies, our allies, the French, a loan of $13 million to help them in their war with Britain. And our people are outraged. That's bribery. That's not diplomacy. So they get their heads together after they kick those three gentlemen out of the room. They get their heads together and they decide two of them will take the bad news to President Adams. One will hang on over in France, still trying to get the meeting without paying the bribes. They tell Adams. Adams is shocked. He tries to kind of keep it within his circle, but the very strongly Federalist Congress hears about it, and they are outraged, and they want Adams to declare war on France because of the insult to our sovereignty and because they're taking our ships. President Adams does what most presidents do in a case like this. He's slid towards the middle because he's the president of everybody, not just the Federalists. And also because we have no real army and we have no real navy. Pardon me. Okay. Where were we? We're in the middle of the XYZ affair because that's what we called this affair. The three gentlemen were never named when this was reported to Congress. They just called them X, Y, and Z. So it's always known as the XYZ affair. And basically Adams tells the Congress, the outraged Congress, we're not going to war. We have no army. We have no navy. We can't go to war with anybody. And we need to be able to settle this diplomatically anyway. Nevertheless, Congress is going to give him money and tell him to build an army. They're actually going to sign a contract with a young gentleman named Eli Whitney, who claims he can provide them with 10,000 muskets, mass-produced, which is unusual. We don't do mass production yet, and interchangeable parts and all of that. They also put up money to finish those frigates that they'd slowed down on making. We had 3 already. What did we have? We had the Constitution, the Constellation, and the United States. Now they're going to finish making the other 3. But no, we're not going to war. This makes Adams unpopular with his own party. He's feeling very, very weak. And as we go into 1798, his second year in office, he's going to do his best to shore up the Federalist Party. He realizes that if we have an election right away, in 1798, they might lose the election. And he's not happy about that. And the Federalists in Congress come up with some laws to protect national security, which are a little bit, that's disingenuous to say they're laws to protect national security. They're really laws to protect the Federalists from the Democratic Republicans. But they all are focused on the French Revolution. They passed an Alien Act. They passed an Alien Enemy Act. Both of those were passed in 1798. In June, I think the 24th of June, the Alien Act gives the president to expel any alien that's in the country who's causing trouble. The Alien Enemy Act gives the president to incarcerate citizens of countries with whom we're at war. You can lock them up, you can deport them. They're also going to pass a Sedition Act a little bit later. They're going to pass that in July of 1798. And basically, that makes it illegal to conspire against legal measures that the government is taking. In other words, to conspire to stop the government from carrying out its functions, including interfering with federal officers and forbidding false, scandalous, or malicious statements against the government or its officers. Now, who defines what's false, scandalous, and malicious is kind of up in the air, and this looks like it's trampling all over our First Amendment rights. Thomas Jefferson doesn't like it. His protege, James Madison, doesn't like it. So they slide off to some of their political friends. Jefferson goes to some of his friends in Kentucky. What they're trying to do is get more than one state involved in this. Madison goes to Virginia, and they persuade their contacts in the local legislatures there to pass some resolutions protesting the Alien Sedition Act and Sedition Acts. By the way, one other act in this group is a Naturalization Act, which extends the time to become a citizen so that you can vote from 5 years to 14 years. What are they doing with all of this? What they're really doing is they're looking at French immigrants as potential supporters of the Democratic Republican Party, and they don't want them to vote. The whole thing about Alien Enemy Act is once again about limiting the action of French immigrants coming to the country. You have to understand, our population was small, and when hundreds of people start flooding in from the French Revolution, it seems to be threatening. James Madison goes to Virginia and gets the Virginia legislature to pass the Virginia Resolution, or the Virginia Resolves, if you want, either way. Thomas Jefferson goes to some of his friends in Kentucky, gets them to pass the Kentucky Resolve, the Kentucky Resolution. What they talk about is that there have to be some limits on federal authority. And what they talk about is a term, I think I may have it. I'm up here on the slide. Okay, on this slide, you've got the Alien Act, 25 June, the Alien Enemies Act, 25 June, the Sedition Act in July, the Naturalization Act was passed before any of them in June. You notice that several of them had term limits. The Alien Act expired by something written in the act that said this act is only effective until for 1 year. The Alien Enemies Act didn't have any expiration date on it. The Sedition Act will expire in 1801. That's written into the act. The Naturalization Act didn't have anything written into it to make it expire, but they passed a new act, which, for all intents and purposes, got rid of that act in 1802. But that's quite a while into the future at this stage of the game. They come up with a couple of terms. You can look at these colorful charts anytime you want to. This one I like. This is about the Sedition Act, and it's got a guy trying to put up a pole. They called it the Freedom Pole up in Massachusetts, and they were down on things like the Stamp Act, the Sedition Act, et cetera, long live the president, other things. The guy that did this went to jail for it under the Sedition Act. There's the Kentucky and Virginia results. Kentucky one was passed on 16 November. Virginia one was passed on 24 December. There's another Kentucky Act passed in the following year. The first two acts that are passed talk about a word that they kind of invented, I think, called interposition. And it basically said that if a number of states decided that the federal government was getting out of hand, they could block federal legislation. After all, they argued, the Constitution was an agreement between the sovereign states. That, by the way, is not the Federalist view, and it's not my view either, but that's what they view. The following year, when they passed the Kentucky resolution, the second one, some people assumed that Thomas Jefferson wrote this one too, but it doesn't look like he really did, and it was worded a lot more harshly, and it introduces a new word, and the new word is nullification. In that second Kentucky resolve, nullification is put forth as any state, which is one of the equal partners in the Constitution, any state can block a federal law that they consider to be unjust. They can block it at least within their own state. Kind of like what Texas is doing, except it's not law. When the president issues a proclamation, says everyone has to have their shots, and the governor of Texas blocks it. That's kind of a form of nullification, although we're not talking about laws in this case. This word's going to bite us in the backside about 30 years down the line. We're going to regret this. I have to say that neither Jefferson nor Madison were planning any kind of revolt against the government. They were just expressing their displeasure about the Alien and Sedition Acts. And they're going to use it because Thomas Jefferson's going to campaign for president. He's the sitting vice president while he's doing all of this. Now, we have an election. Where's the election on here? It's got to be on here somewhere. The candidates. For the Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson, and to balance it off, since he's from the South, a guy from up north, Aaron Burr, from New York. On the Federalist side, they're of course going to renominate the sitting president, John Adams, and they'll pick Charles Cotesworth Pinckney this time, another one of the Pinckney boys, to run for vice president. A funny thing's going to happen in the Electoral College. Remember, guy with the most votes is president, second most votes is vice president, and everybody else goes home crying. John Adams got 65 votes. Pinckney got 64 votes. Thomas Jefferson got 73, so he wins, right? Oops, little problem. Aaron Burr gets 73 too. Normally, they would arrange, one party arranges to have the one they want for vice president to get one less vote. Somehow that got messed up. So the guy that they were really choosing for president and the guy they were really choosing for vice president are tied. Now the vote goes to Congress to settle. They're going to cast ballots 35 times. And they can't break the tie. And finally, Alexander Hamilton starts going to people saying, I know Aaron Burr. We're from the same state. You don't want him for president. And he arranges with a couple of delegations. One delegation, just don't vote. If you don't want to vote for Jefferson, don't vote for anybody. And he gets another delegation to change their vote. And the end result is, on the 36th ballot in Congress, Thomas Jefferson's going to win. So Aaron Burr will be vice president. And of course, Aaron Burr blames Alexander Hamilton for not getting to be president, even though he was supposed to be running for vice president all along. He got bitten by the ambition bug. And the problem that a lot of people had with Aaron Burr, he was a likable person, he was a veteran of the American Revolution. They didn't necessarily trust him to care for the country more than he cared for himself. This is the problem Hamilton had with him. Now, okay, the election's over. Who's president? Who's president now? Who's president in January of 1797? Anybody? Quick. Oh, okay, answer this. Get a gold star. Who's the president? The election was completed in 1796. Who's the president in 1797 in January? Yes, it's a trick question. It's still John Adams. Jefferson hasn't been inaugurated yet. He won't be inaugurated until March, and John Adams isn't done with this. First of all, I should mention this. He's going to solve the problem with France. He gets Charles Cotesworth Pinckney out of the way. He gets all of the other two guys out of the way, and he sends a guy named William Vans Murray. And Murray's a pretty smart cookie. And Murray manages to get all the way to Napoleon Bonaparte, kind of bypasses Talleyrand. And Bonaparte's busy trying to dominate Europe, and he really doesn't want to be bothered by this all. He says, okay, we won't take any American ships. Let's be friends. So Murray is able to tell Adams, okay, the problem's over with. The problem for Adams is that it happens after he's lost the election. If it happened before he lost the election, he probably would have won it. So sad. But as I said, he's not done yet. And he's going to pass an act or have Congress, which is still firmly Federalist until the government changes over. He's going to call it the Judiciary Act of 1801. They're going to establish 16 more courts, federal courts, circuit courts, and each court will have a judge appointed. And of course the Federalist Senate will approve it. A lot of other minor appointments. In Washington, D.C., he's going to appoint 42 new justices of the peace. And on the side of that, he's also going to appoint John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the United States, who'll become our third Chief Justice. Third, maybe fourth. Fourth Chief Justice. Thomas Jefferson is furious, but he can't do anything about it because he hasn't been sworn into office yet. He won't go into office until the 4th of March. Okay. We're running out of time. We're gonna talk about this election again briefly when we start next time. And the reason we're gonna talk about it is what I call the election of 1800. I call it the Second American Revolution. And the reason I call it that is because it's the first time that power in our government has been changed from one party or one group to another, and it's achieved peacefully. Well, it was a bitter election, but when the new government reported in, we didn't have a revolution, the army didn't rise up, none of that happened. And that's usually a sign that a young government is going to survive, that the country will survive because its system works. I'll ask you about that next class. See how many people can remember that. How many people were awake? People in my room are practically asleep on their table. I do see some pens moving. Not sure if they're actually writing notes or just drawing pictures. Okay. See you next time, and you'll start seeing comments on your contributions concerning the essay question. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.
Your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes. Your conference is now over. Goodbye.